The mist clung to the cemetery like a shroud, weaving between weathered headstones as dawn broke over the silent grounds. James had been the gravedigger here for 30 years, his calloused hands knowing the soil's secrets better than anyone. That morning, he noticed them again, the middle-aged couple who visited every Tuesday, carefully removing flowers from one grave and placing them on another. It defied cemetery protocol, yet something in their furtive movements stopped him from intervening immediately. Their actions seemed driven by something deeper than disrespect. As he watched from behind an ancient oak, the woman wiped tears that matched the morning dew. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens when James finally confronts this mysterious couple. James had spent most of his life among the dead. The cemetery had become more home to him than the small cottage at the edge of town where he returned each evening. After his wife, Sarah, passed 15 years ago, buried beneath the willow tree in the eastern corner, he found solace in tending to others' final resting places. The irony wasn't lost on him. He couldn't save Sarah from cancer, but he could ensure everyone's loved ones had dignity in death. His weathered face carried deep lines, each one etched by grief and the passing seasons. The other groundskeepers were decades younger, often avoiding conversation with the old man who seemed to prefer the company of tombstones to people. They didn't understand that each grave he dug was an act of reverence, a final service to those who could no longer speak for themselves. James had established strict rules for himself and the cemetery. Order meant respect, and respect was all the dead had left. The flower policy was simple. Arrangements stayed where mourners placed them. Moving them was tantamount to disturbing the dead. This couple's actions gnawed at him. For weeks, he'd watched them transfer fresh lilies from the elaborate Anderson mausoleum to a simple marker in the paupers section. His professional integrity demanded intervention, yet something in their demeanor, a certain reverence in their transgression, made him hesitate. When the cemetery board president, Victor Hargrove, arrived for the monthly inspection, James's quiet observation was shattered. "What's this I hear about flower theft?" Hargrove's voice boomed across the morning stillness. "Reynolds says you've been allowing visitors to redistribute arrangements." Several mourners turned to stare. The couple froze mid-transfer, lilies suspended between graves. "I've been monitoring the situation," James replied quietly. "Monitoring? Your job is enforcement, not observation." Hargrove gestured dramatically toward the couple. "This is exactly why the board questions your competence. At your age, perhaps it's time to consider retirement." The public dressing down burned through James like acid. 30 years of service reduced to this moment of humiliation. The couple looked on with horror, the woman clutching the flowers to her chest like a shield. James stood straighter, feeling the weight of all eyes upon him. Something about this couple's secret demanded understanding, not punishment, and he would discover what it was, even if it cost him his position. James stood his ground as Hargrove's voice echoed through the cemetery. The board president's expensive suit and polished shoes seemed out of place among the weathered headstones. "This is a cemetery, not a flower market," Hargrove continued, loud enough for everyone within 50 yards to hear. "These people are desecrating the Anderson plot, a family that donates substantially to our endowment fund, I might add." The couple had frozen in place, the woman still holding lilies while the man protectively placed his arm around her shoulders. Their faces had drained of color. "Mr. Hargrove," James said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss this in private." "There's nothing to discuss. Either do your job or we'll find someone who will." Hargrove pulled out his phone and began taking photos of the couple. "Evidence for the board meeting next week. I'm recommending disciplinary action against you, James." Several visitors had stopped to watch the confrontation. James felt heat rising in his neck as decades of respect in the community seemed to evaporate under Hargrove's public dressing down. The following morning, James arrived to find a formal written warning taped to the door of his maintenance shed. The fluorescent pink paper ensured everyone would notice it. The younger groundskeepers exchanged glances as he removed it, their whispers barely concealed. 30 years without incident. One murmured to another, "And now he's losing it." James tucked the warning into his pocket and went about his duties, the weight of it burning against his thigh throughout the day. At lunch, he sat alone on his usual bench, unwrapping his sandwich when Hargrove appeared again, this time with 2 board members in tow. "We're conducting an impromptu inspection," Hargrove announced, not bothering with a greeting. "The board is concerned about overall standards slipping." For the next hour, They followed James through his routine, noting every imperfection: a slightly overgrown patch near the north fence, a bird dropping on a memorial bench, a wheelbarrow left out rather than stored in the shed. "Your attention to detail isn't what it used to be," one board member remarked, scribbling in her notebook. "Perhaps Mr. Hargrove is right about considering retirement options." James's hands trembled slightly as he clipped the edge of a grave site, feeling like an apprentice rather than the master caretaker he had been for decades. The final humiliation came the following Tuesday. James had arrived early, determined to intercept the couple and understand their actions before Hargrove could interfere again. But when he reached the maintenance shed, he found the lock changed. "Board decision," explained Reynolds, the youngest groundskeeper, avoiding eye contact as he handed over a new key. "You're to be supervised for the foreseeable future. I'm supposed to, shadow you today." James took the key, his dignity hanging by a thread. "I see. And Mr. Hargrove left this for you." Reynolds handed him an envelope containing a retirement package offer. As they walked through the morning mist, Reynolds kept a respectful distance. Near the willow where Sarah rested, James paused, touching the bark of the tree that had grown strong over her remains. "You know," James said quietly, "before I became a gravedigger, I was a court stenographer for 20 years. Reynolds looked surprised. "I didn't know that." "You do. I recorded thousands of testimonies, depositions, legal arguments. Learn to listen for what people aren't saying." James's eyes drifted to the Anderson mausoleum. "I developed quite a knack for uncovering the truth beneath people's words." He straightened his back, a subtle determination replacing the defeat in his eyes. "Sometimes the most important stories are the ones people try hardest to bury." As James spoke, a silver-haired woman in an expensive suit washed from beneath a distant oak. Eleanor Blackwood, cemetery board president, narrowed her eyes thoughtfully. She tapped her phone once, canceling Hargrove's scheduled performance review. This situation required her personal attention. The morning fog clung to the cemetery like a shroud, obscuring the distant headstones and lending an ethereal quality to the grounds. James moved methodically through his routine, Reynolds trailing behind him with the awkward discomfort of someone forced into an unwanted role. "You don't have to follow me quite so closely," James said without turning around. "I'm not going to make a run for it." "Sorry, Mr. Winters. Just following orders," Reynolds replied, adjusting the distance between them. James nodded, his mind elsewhere. For 3 decades, he had been the keeper of this sacred ground, the guardian of final resting places. Now, he was being treated like an incompetent liability. The retirement package in his locker felt less like an offer and more like an ultimatum. As they approached the section where he had repeatedly spotted the mysterious couple, James slowed his pace. His court stenographer days had taught him patience. Sometimes the most revealing testimonies came after long silences. "Reynolds, would you mind fetching the small pruning shears from the shed? I noticed some overgrowth on the Hendricks plot that needs attention." The young man hesitated. "Mr. Hargrove said I shouldn't leave you alone. And what exactly does he think I'll do? Dig someone up?" James chuckled, the sound hollow even to his own ears. "The shears, please. I'd get them myself, but since I'm being supervised." Once Reynolds reluctantly departed, James moved quickly to the willow tree near Sarah's grave. From this vantage point, he could observe without being immediately visible. He extracted a small notebook from his pocket, a habit from his stenographer days he'd never abandoned, and began jotting down observations about the surrounding plots. 20 minutes later, his patience was rewarded. The couple appeared, moving with the same purposeful stealth he'd witnessed before. The woman carried fresh lilies, while the man glanced nervously around the cemetery grounds. James remained motionless, watching as they approached a modest headstone, the Fitzgerald plot. The woman knelt, removing the slightly wilted flowers that had been placed there days earlier. The man took these and walked approximately 50 yards to a much larger, more ornate monument, the Hargrove family mausoleum. James's breath caught. The connection suddenly crystallized in his mind. With practiced efficiency, the man placed the removed flowers at the base of the Hargrove monument, while the woman arranged the fresh lilies at the Fitzgerald grave. The entire exchange took less than 2 minutes before they departed, following the same path they always took. James waited until they were out of sight before approaching the Fitzgerald headstone. The simple marker read, "Elizabeth Fitzgerald, 1952 to 2010." beloved mother and friend. He carefully photographed the grave with his phone, then moved to the Hargrove Mausoleum where the transferred flowers now rested. The imposing structure housed generations of the Hargrove family, including a marker for Richard Hargrove Sr., 1949 to 2015. Pillar of the community, devoted father. James photographed this as well, his mind working through the implications. He returned to his maintenance duties just as Reynolds reappeared with the shears. "Sorry it took so long. Couldn't find them at first," the young man apologized. "No matter," James replied, his voice lighter than it had been in days. That evening, instead of heading home, James drove to the county courthouse. The building was mostly empty, but he knew the archives remained open until 7. The security guard recognized him from his years of service. "James Winters. Haven't seen you around these parts in ages. What brings you back?" "Research project, Carl. Nothing exciting." In the basement archives, James requested the public records for Elizabeth Fitzgerald and Richard Hargrove Sr. As a former court employee, he still knew his way around the filing system better than most current staff. Hours later, surrounded by documents, birth certificates, and newspaper clippings, the picture became clearer. Elizabeth Fitzgerald had worked as a housekeeper for the Hargrove family for over 20 years. She had a son, born in 1975, father unlisted. Richard Hargrove Sr. had been a prominent businessman and philanthropist, whose generous donations had funded the cemetery's expansion, including the section where Elizabeth was buried. James photographed several key documents before returning everything to its proper place. On his way out, he made one final request: a copy of Richard Hargrove Sr.'s will. The next morning, James arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual. He found Eleanor Blackwood waiting by his maintenance shed, her silver hair immaculate despite the early hour. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a nod. "This is unexpected." "Walk with me, James," she said, not a request but a gentle command. They strolled in silence until reaching a bench overlooking the eastern section of the cemetery. The rising sun cast long shadows across the graves. "Hargrove tells me you've become obsessed with some visitors," she finally said. "Says you're making accusations that could damage the cemetery's reputation." James considered his words carefully. "I've made no accusations. I've simply observed patterns that raise questions." "And what patterns might those be?" He removed his notebook, along with the printed documents from his courthouse visit. "The couple I've been watching has been moving flowers from Elizabeth Fitzgerald's grave to the Hargrove Mausoleum. At first, I thought it strange, perhaps disrespectful." Eleanor's expression remained neutral as he continued. "Elizabeth worked for the Hargrove family for decades. Her son, Thomas Fitzgerald, was born when she was 23. No father listed." James laid out the birth certificate. "Thomas and his wife are our mysterious visitors. This proves nothing beyond a former employee's son visiting our cemetery," Eleanor noted. "True," James agreed. "But I found something else interesting in Richard Hargrove Sr.'s will." He produced the document. A trust fund established for Thomas Fitzgerald with very specific conditions. The money comes to him only if he maintains absolute discretion about certain matters. The trust is administered by his son, our current manager. Eleanor's eyebrow raised slightly. "Go on." "I believe Thomas is Richard Sr.'s illegitimate son. The younger Hargrove knows this, which explains his hostility toward the flower exchanges. There is silent acknowledgement of a connection his father wanted buried." James closed his notebook. "Thomas and his wife are honoring both his parents in the only way they can without violating the terms of the trust." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "You were wasted as a gravedigger, James." "I prefer caretaker," he corrected gently. "And I've never considered it a waste." "What do you intend to do with this information?" James looked out over the cemetery, his home for 30 years. "Nothing destructive, but I won't be forced into retirement over doing my job properly. These grounds deserve respect, as do the stories of those buried here." Eleanor stood, brushing invisible dust from her immaculate suit. "I'll be calling an emergency board meeting this afternoon. Hargrove's supervision mandate will be rescinded immediately." She paused. "Your warning will also be removed from your file." "Thank you," James said simply. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "The board may have questions about your methods." "I've done nothing improper." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But you've demonstrated that you see more than most people are comfortable with." She handed him a business card. "My private number. If you observe anything else noteworthy, I'd appreciate hearing about it directly." As she walked away, James realized he'd been granted something rare, respect from someone in power. He pocketed her card and returned to his duties, the weight on his shoulders considerably lighter. That afternoon, as James tended to Sarah's grave, he noticed Thomas Fitzgerald and his wife in the distance. This time, they moved without their usual caution, placing flowers at both graves openly. James nodded to them, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding of love that transcended social boundaries. Some stories deserve to be remembered, even if they weren't carved in stone. What about you? I'd love to know where you're watching this story from. Comment below and let me know what part of the world you're experiencing this tale from. The next morning, James found an envelope on his desk containing old photographs of Richard Sr. with Elizabeth and a threatening note. Keep digging and you'll be buried next. The Hargrove family has more secrets than you can imagine. James stared at the threatening note, his weathered hands trembling slightly. After 30 years of tending to the dead, he found himself caught in the affairs of the living. Dangerous affairs, it seemed. The photographs told a story the Hargrove family had tried to bury. Richard Sr. and Elizabeth, clearly in love, in candid moments never meant for public eyes. He locked the evidence in his desk drawer and gazed out the window at the cemetery grounds. The morning mist clung to the headstones like reluctant ghosts. This place had been his sanctuary, his purpose. Now it felt like quicksand beneath his feet. His phone rang, startling him. James? It's Eleanor. The board meeting didn't go as planned. Hargrove brought lawyers. They're claiming you've been harassing visitors and conducting unauthorized investigations. James closed his eyes. I've received a threat. A sharp intake of breath. What kind? The kind that suggests I'm getting too close to something. Don't do anything rash, Eleanor warned. The Hargroves have considerable influence. I've spent my life respecting the dead and their stories, James replied. I won't stop now. After hanging up, James made 3 calls. First to Thomas Fitzgerald, arranging a meeting. Second to Eleanor, requesting access to the cemetery's historical records. Third to Martin Chun, a retired detective who'd visited his wife's grave every Sunday for 15 years. By noon, they gathered in James's modest office among the maintenance buildings. Thomas and his wife Claire, Eleanor, and Martin. The small room felt crowded with tension and unspoken fears. I didn't expect a committee, Thomas said nervously, eyeing the strangers. We need allies, James explained, spreading the photographs on his desk. The Hargroves are powerful, and they're threatening me to keep these secrets buried. Claire gasped at the photos. That's your mother, Thomas. She looks so young. Thomas picked up a photograph, his fingers tracing his mother's face. She never told me outright, just said my father was someone important who couldn't acknowledge me. Eleanor examined the threatening note. This constitutes a criminal threat. We should go to the police. With what? Martin asked, his detective instincts evident. A vague note? Photos that prove nothing illegal? The Hargroves would bury this before it reached a report. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? Eleanor asked, ever practical. James looked at Thomas. That's up to you. This is your history. Thomas exchanged glances with Claire before speaking. I don't want money or scandal. I just want to honor both my parents without hiding. My mother spent her life in shadows. I won't let them erase her in death too. Then we need leverage, Martin said. Something that makes Hargrove back off without destroying the family name he's so desperate to protect. James opened his desk drawer and removed a leather-bound ledger. Cemetery records from Richard Sr.'s time as chairman. I've been reviewing them since this morning. Eleanor frowned. Those should be in the administrative archives. They were in the maintenance shed, buried under decades of equipment manuals, James replied. And they show some interesting discrepancies in plot purchases and burials during Richard Sr.'s tenure. Martin leaned forward. What kind of discrepancies? Several plots were purchased anonymously through the Hargrove Foundation. The burials were conducted after hours, minimal documentation. James turned several flagged pages, and 3 of them coincide with unsolved disappearances reported in local papers. The room fell silent. Are you suggesting Richard Hargrove Sr. was involved in? Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. I'm not suggesting anything, James said carefully. But these records raise questions that would interest journalists and possibly law enforcement. Thomas looked ill. If this is true, my father, we don't know what happened, James said gently. But Richard Jr. might, and he's desperate to keep his family's reputation intact. Eleanor straightened her jacket. This is a dangerous game, James. It's not a game at all, he replied. It's about truth and respect for the living and the dead. They formulated their plan carefully. Eleanor would request an urgent meeting with Richard Jr. in the cemetery's memorial chapel, neutral ground with historical significance to the Hargrove family. James would present the evidence, with Martin present as a witness with law enforcement connections. Thomas and Claire would wait nearby, ready to join if needed. As dusk fell, the cemetery took on an otherworldly quality. The chapel's stained glass caught the last rays of sunlight, casting colored shadows across the stone floor. James stood at the altar, the ledger and photographs arranged before him like offerings. Eleanor arrived first, tension evident in her rigid posture. He's coming. Alone, as requested. Martin positioned himself near the door, his presence unobtrusive but unmistakable. When Richard Hargrove Jr. entered, his customary arrogance seemed diminished by the solemnity of the setting. This had better be important, Eleanor. I don't appreciate being summoned like a schoolboy. Thank you for coming, Mr. Hargrove, James said, drawing the man's attention. Richard's face darkened. You. I should have known. What is this theatrical nonsense? Please sit. James gestured to the front pew. We have matters to discuss regarding your father. My father is none of your concern, Richard snapped, but took the seat. James carefully laid out the photographs. Your father and Elizabeth Fitzgerald. Richard barely glanced at them. Ancient history. Meaningless. Not to her son, James replied. Not to Thomas. Half-brother or not. He's been compensated generously to maintain his discretion, Richard said dismissively. James nodded. Yes, the trust fund. But I wonder if that was your father's idea or yours. A way to control a narrative that threatened your position. Richard's eyes narrowed. You're overstepping, Gravedigger. And then there's this. James opened the ledger. Unusual burials during your father's chairmanship, coinciding with some troubling events in the community. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, James said. I'm offering a choice. Eleanor stepped forward. The board doesn't want scandal, Richard. Neither do you. But we won't tolerate threats against our employees or disrespect toward those who visit our grounds. Richard stood abruptly. This is blackmail. This is negotiation, James corrected. Thomas Fitzgerald and his wife will visit these grounds and honor both his parents without interference. I will continue my duties until I choose to retire. And in return, these records remain private. Richard's face contorted with fury and fear. You have no idea what you're meddling with. Some secrets should stay buried. I've spent my life ensuring the dead rest in peace, James said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. But peace requires truth, not silence. Richard looked from James to Eleanor to Martin, calculating his options. The chapel seemed to hold its breath, generations of Hargroves watching from the memorial plaques lining the walls. What's your decision, Mr. Hargrove? James asked quietly. Do we resolve this here, now with dignity? Or shall we let others unearth what's been buried? Richard's shoulders slumped, the weight of generations of Hargrove's secrets visibly pressing down on him. The stained glass shadows stretched across his face, painting him in fragments of color that seemed to reveal the fractured man beneath the polished exterior. You have no idea what you're asking, he said, his voice hollow. My father built this town. The Hargrove name stands for something. Yes, James replied quietly. But what does it stand for, Richard? That's the question we're facing now. Richard paced the narrow aisle, his expensive shoes clicking against the stone floor. Those records, they're not what you think. Times were different then. Different enough to justify unmarked graves? James asked. Different enough to deny a son his heritage? Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm but not unkind. The board doesn't want to erase history, Richard. We want to honor it properly. All of it. Richard stopped at the chapel window, staring out at the darkening cemetery. My father wasn't a perfect man, but he protected this town, made difficult decisions when no one else would. At what cost? James pressed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. If this becomes public, Richard finally said, everything my family built will crumble. Not everything, James countered. Only the parts built on lies. Richard turned, his face a battlefield of pride and fear. What exactly do you want? Acknowledgement, James said simply. Thomas Fitzgerald deserves to be recognized as your father's son. The unmarked graves need proper headstones, and the board needs to operate independently, without your interference. You're asking me to surrender my family's legacy. I'm asking you to redeem it, James corrected. Richard's laugh was bitter. And if I refuse? If I call your bluff? Martin shifted slightly, his presence a reminder of the evidence they held. Then we'll let the truth speak for itself, Eleanor said. Every document, every photograph. The town will judge the Hargrove legacy for themselves. Richard's face flushed with anger, then drained to ashen resignation. My father warned me, he muttered. He said our power depended on controlling the narrative. Never let them see the full picture, Richard, he told me. Once they do, you've lost. James watched the man's internal struggle, feeling neither triumph nor pity, only the quiet certainty that some truths needed daylight to heal. I'll agree to your terms, Richard finally said, each word seeming to cost him physically. Thomas can visit without interference. The board will operate independently, but the unmarked graves. He hesitated. Those require delicacy. Some families may not want old wounds reopened. We'll proceed with respect, Eleanor assured him. But proceed we must. Richard nodded stiffly. Is that all? One more thing, James said. Your resignation from the board. Richard's head snapped up. That's going too far. It's necessary, Eleanor interjected. A clean break, a new chapter. The chapel fell silent again as Richard weighed his options, the portraits of his ancestors seeming to watch with judgment from the walls. Very well, he finally conceded, his voice barely audible. But the Hargrove financial contributions continue. Our name remains on the memorial garden. Agreed, Eleanor said. Richard straightened his jacket, attempting to reclaim some dignity. I trust this concludes our business. As he walked toward the door, his steps heavy with defeat, he paused beside James. You think you've won some great victory for justice, Gravedigger. But some secrets stay buried for a reason. Remember that. With those words hanging in the air, Richard Hargrove Jr. stepped out into the gathering darkness, taking with him the last vestiges of his family's unchallenged authority. The morning dew glistened on the headstones as James made his rounds through the cemetery. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Richard Hargrove, and the weight that had pressed upon his shoulders for years had finally lifted. The unmarked graves now bore proper headstones, each name etched with dignity. Thomas visited his father's grave regularly, sometimes bringing his children, who placed wildflowers by the stone. The board operated independently, with Eleanor as the new chairperson, guiding decisions with wisdom and transparency. James knelt beside a freshly dug plot, smoothing the earth with practiced hands. His work felt different now, purposeful rather than burdensome. The secrets he'd carried for so long had been released, like birds from a long-closed cage. As he worked, he noticed an elderly woman approaching from the eastern path. She walked with determination despite her frail appearance, clutching a weathered leather journal to her chest. James had never seen her before. Mr. Thornton, she called, her voice surprisingly strong. I understand you're the man who isn't afraid to uncover the truth. James stood, brushing dirt from his hands. I just believe everyone deserves to be remembered properly. She extended the journal toward him. Then perhaps you'll help me with this. It belonged to my sister who worked as a nurse at Hargrove Manor during the war. James accepted the journal, feeling its weight, both physical and metaphorical. There are more secrets buried here than just bodies, she whispered. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel for more emotional narratives that explore family secrets and redemption. Like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. What secrets do you think might be hidden in that journal?